I don't know of anything else that shapes your thinking more than the question, is there a God? Now, obviously, there are other questions that will follow if you answer in the affirmative, the question of which God and how do we know which one. But for now, I want to deal with the flip side of it. And the reason I deal with the flip side of it is because the atheists often assume that the theist is the only one that has to give all the answers, that they can just raise the questions. It's not true. They have to find some answers as well. I remember in the 1980s, during my graduate studies, in that period of time, 70s and 80s, spending endless hours reading the atheistic philosopher Anthony Flew. We were taught to understand Flew, to read everything Flew had written, to get at the core of his argument, and somehow try to respond to the questions he was raising, whether truth is knowable, whether truth is verifiable, if language about truth and logic really has any reflection on reality, all these things. Little did I know that about 30 years later, he would renounce his atheism. So here I was in graduate school studying Flew, only to find out a year ago, Flew has flown the coop. He no longer considers atheism tenable. Now, he's not yet come all the way. He's in the halfway mark of deism, and he also makes the comment very clearly that if there is a God, it would have to be the God of the Christian faith. And his studies on the writings of N.T. Wright and the resurrection, he goes on record as saying, this is the most persuasive thing I've read, a combination of N.T. Wright and C.S. Lewis. I would never have known, reading in the 60s, the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre, that on his deathbed, the atheist existentialist philosopher, Sartre, would say he could no longer trust himself as an atheistic thinker because he found it didn't just fit together. One of the most hedonistic writers who ever lived was Oscar Wilde. I wrote a book on an imaginary conversation between Wilde and Jesus in a book I wrote called Sense and Sensuality. Jesus talks to Oscar Wilde. I remember in my time of research, going into London and then into Paris, walking into the very church where his funeral was held. And interestingly enough, there wasn't a sound or a note of music in Oscar Wilde's funeral. This man was a hedonist. No music at his funeral. There's a little twist to it all. In the same church that Oscar Wilde had his funeral, in the back of the church hangs the jacket of Blaise Pascal, the French writer. And in that jacket was pinned the testimonial conversion of Pascal, where he described it in one word, fire. And here he was, having lived a life sensually driven, deliberately pleasurable, with no boundaries for him, brilliant in his writings. And he's lying in his bed and he says to his lover, Robbie Ross, thinking of all of the exploits and the lives they'd plundered. And he says, Robbie, with any one of those little boys that you loved and I loved, did you love any one of them for their own sakes? Think of that. What a question. Did you love any one of them for their own sake? Robbie Ross says no. He goes on to say, bring me a minister, for only Christ now is big enough to cleanse this heart of mine. You know, ladies and gentlemen, atheism has this tremendous attraction and seduction because it has the appearance of a world without boundaries. It has the scaffolding on which you can plant any kind of structure you want, only to find out it doesn't hold for the most important questions of your life. So in the time that I have tonight, and I'm going to race through some of this, I'm taking the first part of my talk here, and even though I said it tongue-in-cheek earlier, really, a subject like this doesn't do anything for my soul. It really doesn't. I'd sooner sit back at home and put my head on a cushion and get a little sleep. That might do something better for me. But you have to deal with these issues. It's almost the bane of my existence to have to drive a wedge into issues as Ray does and Kirk does and some of the other speakers here. But it has to be done because you have to think your worldview through. And maybe there are some of you here tonight who have flirted with a secularized lifestyle, with a world without boundaries, and thought to yourself, maybe there is a greater attraction to all of this than the world that I actually live by and want to try my best to follow. I want to read for you an extensive passage. It is powerful if you follow every metaphor and see every hint of an idea here. It was written by a man who lived between 1844 and 1900. His name was Friedrich Nietzsche. He was one of the most brilliant German philosophers, a nihilistic philosopher of meaninglessness. He had an influence on Adolf Hitler. Nietzsche's writings were taken by Hitler and presented personally to Stalin and Mussolini. He's the man who coined the phrase, God is dead. He's the one who talked about the supremacy of being the Superman, a man who could pull himself up by his own metaphysical bootstraps. This is Nietzsche. The irony of it is Nietzsche's father was a pastor. Both of his grandfathers were in the ministry, and yet he renounced his faith in God. He believed intellectually it didn't come together. It didn't hold together. And so he wrote this parable. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, who ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, I'm looking for God. I'm looking for God. As many of those who did not believe in God were standing together there, he excited considerable laughter. Have you lost him, said one. Did he lose his way like a child, said another. Maybe God is hiding. Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage or emigrated? Thus they shouted and laughed him to scorn. But the madman sprang into their midst and pierced them with his glances. Where is God? He cried. I'll tell you, we have killed him, you and I. We are all his murderers. But how were we able to do this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us a sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? Notice the metaphors he's using here. How are we able to drink up a whole sea? How are we able to erase the horizon? You see, these are the demarcations of life. And so he's asking this. What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Do you think we are now perpetually falling backwards and forwards and sidewards in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not suddenly become colder? Is not more and more night coming on us all the time? Must not lanterns have to be lit in the morning hours? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of grave diggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? God's decomposed too, you know, and he is now dead. He remains dead. We have killed him. Now, how shall we, the murderer of all murderers, compose ourselves? Because that which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water can we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games will we need to invent? Is this not too great a deed for us? Must we not now ourselves have to become God, simply to seem worthy of it? There's never been a greater deed than this, you know, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent, and again regarded his listeners. They too were silent, and they stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern to the ground, and it broke and it went out. I come too early. My time has not yet come. It has been related further on the same day that the madman entered diverse churches and there sang a requiem, aeternam Deo. Let out and quieted, he is said to have retorted each time, what are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of a dead God? God is dead, we have killed him. You know, the irony of Nietzsche's life is that the last 14 years of his life he spent in an insane asylum himself. And his mother was a godly woman would sit by his bedside, and he would go into weeks and weeks and weeks of silence, and suddenly would burst out with some words. And you know what they would invariably be? Words of scripture which he'd memorized as a younger boy. An irony to what he's saying. Is there any up or down left? Must we not have to light lanterns in the morning hours because we have wiped away the entire horizon and erased any points of measurement? There's a poet who wrote this. First, dentistry was painless, then bicycles were chainless, and carriages were horseless, and many laws enforceless. Next, cookery was fireless, telegraphy was wireless, cigars were nicotineless, and coffee caffeineless. Soon oranges were seedless, the putting green was weedless, the college boy was hatless, the proper diet fatless. New motor roads are dustless, the latest steel is rustless, our tennis courts are sodless, our new religion godless. We have come to a point now of seeing life in a way that we in the West are trying to define without God. You know, I've just got off a plane 3 days ago. I've been gone for about a month, speaking the last week in Hong Kong. And you talk to an average Chinese who has just come out of China, and they will tell you it's the fastest growing church in the world. They tried it the godless way, and it cost them tens of millions of lives in the process because somebody had to play God. And I would speak there day after day, night after night, and see powerful Chinese Christian businessmen and women, brilliant young students, and one night speaking to political leadership at a club, and they would listen and listen and listen, and they are hungry to find out what the Christian faith is all about and how its ramifications work out in culture. While they are pursuing that way, we are trying to find out how to go the godless way out here. It's a strange affliction that has stricken the West, that has lived off the capital and the bequest of the Judeo-Christian worldview. And now we want to stand planting our feet firmly in midair. It's a tragedy. The idea is this: if there is no moral lawgiver who is transcendent to you and me, then there is no moral law by which we must dictate our lives except the moral law that we invent for ourselves. Now, I want you to follow this very carefully, because this is not an argument easily understood. I get it again and again and again, and I got it from a brilliant Fulbright scholar last week in Hong Kong. And they generally will listen to something I've said on tape or written, and then I can predict what the question is going to be. Actually, if you walk into any university campus, if you give me a blank sheet of paper, I'll write out 20 questions and tell you these are the questions for tonight. I haven't heard a new one in a long, long time. Oh, names may change, ideas don't. Malcolm Muggeridge said all new news is old news happening to new people. And so I tell a story of this time I was in the University of Nottingham many, many years ago. It was in the early days of apologetics, very daunting. And a student shot up out of his seat and he just shouted at me and he said, "There cannot be a God because there's too much evil in this world." I said, "Remain standing, I'd like to interact with you. When you say there's evil, aren't you assuming that such a thing is good?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When you say there's such a thing as good, aren't you assuming there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil?" He struggled with that for a moment, because he knew he was possibly going into some quicksand. But you see, you can't struggle with that for a moment. You have to say, is there a moral law? Bertrand Russell, when he was debating the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, Copleston said to him in their debate, which is given in Russell's book, Why I'm Not a Christian, Copleston says to him, do you believe in the difference between good and bad? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between it? Bertrand Russell said, the same way I differentiate between blue and green. Copleston said, wait a minute, you differentiate between blue and green by seeing, don't you? He said, yes. How do you differentiate between good and bad? And Russell said, on the basis of feeling. What else? Copleston was a kind man. He really should have said, Mr. Russell, in some cultures they love their neighbors, in other cultures they eat them, both on the basis of feeling. Do you have any personal preference? And I told that story to this fellow. He said, okay, I guess there has to be a moral law. I said, you say there's too much of evil in this world. When you say there's evil, you assume there's good. When you assume there's good, you assume there's such a thing as a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. He said, I'll grant you that. I said, but if you assume a moral law, you must posit a moral lawgiver, but that's whom you're trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is your question? I promise you this is exactly what happened. He looked at me. He said, what then am I asking you? I said, I'm not going to help you if you don't know what the question is. But you know, he was caught in the moment of experiential inescapability. Here he was trying to argue too much evil. But in experience, it suddenly came down to the heart, and he thought to himself, why am I asking this? Because if I'm a real naturalist, there's no such thing as evil. We're all dancing to our DNA. That's what Richard Dawkins said. Now, here's the point, and I want you to follow me. Why do we have to have a moral lawgiver? That's the big gap that the questioner cannot seem to cross. They'll say something like, all right, I say there's such a thing as evil, I assume there's good, I assume there's such a thing as a moral law. Why do I have to go to a moral lawgiver? In fact, the guy who questioned me in Hong Kong on this subject put the question in these words. You know, as evolution came about and we developed our pragmatic ways, we came about to barter things, and currency came into being, and economics and so on. Why can't we arrive at morality the same way? Evidently, he hadn't given too much thought to the economics of today. What value is money in itself? Nothing. In fact, you ask an average economist, what is money? They really don't have the answer. And so we go and borrow without the ability to repay, and we print money without a standard, and we are digging ourselves into total economic chaos, because we don't have an ontic referent for its real value. Morality has no value unless it has something transcending itself that gives itself the value. And every time you raise the question of evil, follow me now, every time you raise the question of evil, it is either raised by a person or about persons. You don't ask a question like, you know, why does this wood rot? It's terrible that this wood rots. I feel so badly for this wood. No. Why did 10,000 people die? Why the tsunami? It is always raised by a person or about persons. And if the question is of any value, it can only be of value if persons are of value. And the only way a person can have value if there is a transcendent being of infinite worth who has given you that intrinsic worth, not given to you by state or law or by any other fiat will or something else. Which means morality is not an abstraction. It is woven into personhood. The moral law has no value in and of itself unless there is a moral lawgiver of intrinsic worth, by virtue of which all other value pertains.